We share these streets, true tales of everyday folk in bygone Nottingham. Episode 7, Stewart. A military life is often something that runs in families, and that was certainly true for Nottingham lad Stewart, born in July 1920. His dad had been a Grenadier Guard from a very young age, served in the Sherwood Foresters in World War I, and then worked for the military police. Stewart himself signed up with the RAF when he was old enough, and became a wireless operator and air gunner. His younger brother Reginald served in the Navy. He was killed on board the HMS Puckeridge in December 1941 when the ship was attacked by a plane. He was among 18 people killed in the attack. On the 19th of October 1943, the Nottingham Evening Post ran a story on an airman who'd escaped a prisoner of war camp in Italy after being held there for 2 years. That airman was our Stewart. Along with 2 RAF comrades, he had been imprisoned in Italy in 1941. In September 1943, Italy signed an armistice with the US and agreed to surrender to the Allies. Germany responded quickly, invading Italy and establishing the Italian Socialist Republic, a puppet state with Mussolini as its figurehead. The Italian royals and former politicians were relocated to Allied territories. Prisoners of war, though, were in a perilous position. German troops regarded surrendered Italians as the enemy, so prisoner of war camps full of Italians and Allies were in serious danger from the Nazis. In the newspaper report, Stewart is quoted as saying, "We were told what to do if the camp were threatened by Germans, which we thought, of course, very unlikely. Well, on the 12th, the camp alarm went and we immediately evacuated the camp and went up into a mountain about 600 foot high. The Germans came into the camp and, finding no one there, went away again, so some of our chaps went back, but most of us decided to stay for a time in case the Germans returned." The Germans did return. They took the returned soldiers as prisoners and sent patrols up into the mountains. Stewart continued, "With 2 other chaps I decided to start walking to our lines if possible. We changed into civilian clothing and started hiking. We walked about 200 miles over the mountains and after various little incidents reached our first troops by the 16th day. As you can imagine, we were received with open arms by these chaps and given good food and cigarettes." 200 miles over 16 days is about 12 miles or 20 kilometres per day. It's a hell of a hike. The distance is roughly the equivalent of walking from Nottingham to Derby every day for over a fortnight, but the terrain in the mountains would be a lot more demanding than walking along Bryanclough Way. Don't forget the Germans had sent patrols up into the mountains, so Stewart and his pals would be trying to manoeuvre stealthily, covering the ground but not being seen, caught or shot. Their very lives depended on it. I'm curious what the various little incidents were that the escapees encountered. I imagine Stewart was underplaying them, and they probably weren't very little at all. Any one of them would probably be well beyond the abilities of a modern person to survive. Perhaps there were skirmishes with Nazis, negotiations with nervous civilians, or possibly hunting animals for food. Stewart concluded his interview by saying, "I am now waiting to go back to Blighty and home. I can assure you I am all impatient, but I don't think many days will pass before I'm on the way." Stewart's parents at the time lived at 11 Saxon Place, which was off Alfred Street North in St Anne's. Saxon Place no longer exists, and checking old maps we found it's now the site of the Asiana hypermarket on Woodborough Road. In 2020, Alfred Street South turns off Woodborough Road, with Asiana on one corner and that lovely Fothergill Watson clock tower on the other. His parents learned of Stewart's escape in a letter. In the vernacular of the day, the journal describes it as pleasing news, but I imagine it must have felt far more significant. Stewart had been imprisoned around the same time Reginald, his brother, had been killed in the attack on the HMS Puckeridge. It must have been agonising for parents in those times, dependent on telegrams or what we now affectionately call snail mail. Nowadays we'd be making demands of the government to negotiate our relatives' release or starting an online petition. In the early 1940s, you just had to sit and wait. It's estimated there were more than 170,000 British prisoners of war held in Italy and Germany during World War II. The Imperial War Museum website says,
"The Geneva Convention rules, which lay out protections and standards of treatment of prisoners of war, were not always followed, but on the whole the Germans and Italians behaved fairly towards British and Commonwealth prisoners. Even so, conditions were tough, rations were meagre, the men, but not officers, had to work, often at heavy labour. As with the prisoners of the First World War, the days dragged and there was a constant battle against boredom. Prisoners tried to overcome this by staging entertainments and educating themselves. Contrary to the popular myth, most men were too weak from hunger and work to escape. Those who did get beyond the wire ran the very real risk of being shot."
Stewart's escape and 200-mile trek sounds like something from an old war movie that you might see on TV over Christmas or on a bank holiday. I can imagine scenes of him and his RAF brothers in arms hiding in a farmer's barn, and perhaps being discovered by a young farmhand who'd keep their presence secret but sneak a little food into them. The missing food would be noticed by the farmer's wife, who'd investigate with her husband and a shotgun. The airmen would be discovered, and as the family decided what to do with them, there'd be a cry from outside. A German patrol hunting for escaped prisoners. After a tense discussion with the German commander, the family would confirm that they had seen the escapees. 2 days ago, as they headed south, the roar of the departing Nazi engines would herald an understanding for Stewart. The farming family were their allies. Yes, I've overthought it, haven't I? But I probably haven't even got close to how perilous, tiring and epic the journey must have been. Whilst it's easy to criticise Italy and Germany for taking Allied troops prisoner, it's worth remembering that we did exactly the same. One very local prisoner of war camp was actually on our own Wollaton Park. It was opened late in the war, in March 1944, and housed primarily German POWs. At one time there were 4,000 prisoners held there in wooden huts. Wollaton Park is a very special place for many Nottinghamians. It covers 500 acres and touches upon so many residential areas that it's often considered the local park of people who live miles apart. The idea of POWs being held there is at odds with the halcyon view many of us hold of the place. The website tracesofwar.com contains an intriguing detail that one of the buildings from the prisoner of war camp remains to this day. Insight Mapping lists the structure simply as Pavilion, but Google Maps labels it Wollaton Cafe. It's quite close to the entrance near Mr. Mann's Chinese restaurant. If you enter by that gate and head straight on, you'll see the structure on the right about 40 metres from the path. 4 of the huts reportedly remained for a couple of decades and were used as changing rooms in the 1950s and 60s for students doing school sports on Wollaton Park. Why this one hut survived and got adapted over the years is unknown, but it's curious you could now eat a blueberry muffin and sip a latte where a German prisoner of war once cried himself to sleep dreaming of a family hundreds of miles away. For local people, the wartime occupation of Wollaton Park was quite controversial. In October 1945, a letter was published in the Evening Post complaining, amongst other things, that the roads from Wollaton Village to Wollaton Park remained closed. The author of the letter said, "The German POW camp is blamed for this closure. This is not the case. The Americans chose to close 2 main roads into the park, thus keeping villagers out. One road should be freed for pedestrians, and there are plenty of prisoners of war sweeping leaves and hanging around who are available for this clearance." The Americans referred to were the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, part of the 82nd Airborne Division, nicknamed the Red Devils. The 2,000-strong regiment was camped at Wollaton Park in preparation for the D-Day landings when Allied troops invaded Normandy. They were whisked from their camp to airfields in Barton buses. I imagine the scarlet livery of the buses was appealing to the Red Devils. The letter to the post paints a surreal picture of Wollaton Park during the latter part of World War II, with Germans sweeping leaves and hanging around, and American troops stationed there. The troops and prisoners weren't entirely independent from the local community. The BBC People's History website features a comment from a Nottingham man who says that he would regularly see US soldiers around the city and always took time to yell at them,
"Got any gum, chum?"
as they were famously generous with gifts. There are reports of American troops paying for local kids to go on rides during Goose Fair and of taking local women dancing. A newspaper report from the Nottingham Journal in December 1945 discusses the annual Christmas treat for children of Nazareth House Orphanage in Lenton. The Bishop of Nottingham, Dr. E. Ellis, attended the occasion and distributed presents, including 30 gifts that had been made by Wollaton Park's German prisoners. It's usual when we think of wars to think simply in terms of goodies and baddies. Our forces are the good guys, fighting the good fight with heroic goals. The enemy are evil and are executing their devious plans. Really though, I don't see an awful lot of difference between Stewart and Wollaton Park's German toy makers. They were just normal people, fighting because it was their job, and the country's heads of states had sent them to war. The entirely random matter of where you're born dictates which side you're on, and which heads of state you obey. We like to imagine that if we'd been born into Nazi Germany, we'd have defied the authorities and rebelled, but the sad fact is I don't think most of us would. Most of us would fall in line, fearful of repercussions from the brutal authorities that tortured and killed to ensure compliance. We believe Stewart married Kathleen in 1944 and the following year had a son, Jimmy. Stewart's escape from the Italian POW camp was absolutely extraordinary, more akin to some incredible adventure story than anything that most of us might experience in our lives. It's easy to overlook your hometown or think your neighbourhood's boring, but when these adventures happen, they have to happen to someone from somewhere. In this case, it all happened to a lad from St Anne's in Nottingham.
Got any gum, chum?